Good evening. Welcome to the Social Cohesion Network's 2018 Public Seminar Series. It is great to have you all here, and I would like to offer a very special welcome to those of you who are tuning in to our podcast. I'd like to give you a little bit of background information as to who we are before we proceed tonight. My name is Dr. Catherine Morris, and I'm the founder of the Social Cohesion Network. We're a social research and community education organisation, and we're known in short as SCEET. We've been operating since 2008, starting under the umbrella of Coventry Publications and Research. We later separated into two quite distinct organisations. We retained the publications company and added the research and training organisation as its own entity. SCEET's consultants have extensive experience in the social sciences, with over 50 collective years of experience researching and teaching across multiple disciplines. We've also worked as educators in primary schools, high schools and universities, as well as community education. We work in Australia, but we have also worked globally, for example on projects in the Middle East and around the South Pacific. Our qualified PhD team provides high-quality analytical and evaluative research into areas as diverse as gender violence, migration, refugee movement, social policy, inclusive education, peace building and peace ethics, and community development. We can, if people ask us, also tailor our training or research to meet our clients' needs specifically. SCEET also offers some very unique learning programs that are designed to meet individual or community-based organisational needs. An example of this is that we're currently undertaking women's creative writing classes and short courses, and these have been designed particularly so that we can help to empower women in our local communities with a voice so that they can find their stories and be heard. But tonight, we're very proud to introduce one of our senior consultants, our award-winning sociologist, Dr. Yamila Rosdale. Dr. Rosdale's going to present the first in a series titled The Relationship Between Gender and Coercive Control in the Context of Domestic and Family Violence. Now, this topic is of paramount importance to communities all over the world and to policymakers and practitioners as we continue to witness how domestic and family violence, intimate partner violence, crimes against women and girls in particular, result in tragic, life-changing and all too often life-ending outcomes. The first seminar will explore this topic in depth by focusing on a theory developed by Dr. Rosdale that aims to help us understand the depth and scope of the problem of coercive control as a destructive and often invisible threat to the notion of a safe, peaceful and cohesive society. I'd like you to note that while we will take questions in the live presentation at the end, that part of the seminar is not going to be broadcast on the podcast or anywhere else, because we want to protect the individuals here tonight that are participating in the dialogue from being identified. In the spirit of that, I'd like you to now make sure that your mobile phones are turned off, that nobody is recording or photographing anybody in the room tonight. We want everyone to feel safe and welcome.
The panopticon effect is a concept and a theoretical tool that can be used to explain a type of system or social force, an apparatus of power relations, if you like, that produces powerful and threatening processes, control mechanisms, and very strategic instruments of surveillance and discipline generated within a society. And these mechanisms are reworked and they're extended and mobilized, as well as embedded by agents or subjects within that society. And the panopticon effect can be employed to gain further meanings about the phenomenon of violence, and more specifically, coercive control as a gendered form of violence. And so we can therefore also say that the panopticon effect is generated and supported by culture, by our very own language, our beliefs, knowledges, as well as through larger systems and institutions of which gender always forms a part. It's therefore also a social process and a transferable practice that's enacted and embodied by different subjects. So in this way, it's not a single entity in itself. It's not an agency, an innate condition, or a structure. It's an amalgamation of accepted cultural forms, understandings and truths, imagined relationships, and discourses of power knowledge, or stories or myths, if you like. One way that we can recognize the panopticon effect is that it not only creates forms of anonymous manifestations of control and violence, as well as mechanisms of observation, discipline, punishments, and threats of force that alter and train and correct and terrorize individuals to break them down. But it also induces a form of managed behavior, an attitude, and a state of mind in those subjected to it. So it's a condition that can be described as a complete sense of estrangement from life itself, creating a sense of very deep psychic turmoil. Conceptually, the panopticon effect can be used as a method of feminist critique to deconstruct and highlight, as well as demystify, these everyday types of gendered power relations and control techniques, such as the exercise of subtle coercion, intimidation, and threat that sustain relations of power, exploitation, and domination. It's particularly influenced by Michel Foucault's ideas on panopticism, as well as power knowledge, discipline, and discourse, as well as Judith Butler's theories on gender performativity, precarity, precariousness, and vulnerability. The panopticon effect presupposes that we are all exposed to neoliberal, masculinist, paternalist, late capitalist organizations or structures, as well as ideological, political state apparatuses. But we're also vulnerable to the discourses, the symbolic systems, and the social forms which precede our entrance into this world and subjugate, as well as structure, how we think, how we act, how we move, as well as how we interact and how we identify with others as well as ourselves. To Butler, precarity denotes a politically induced condition in which certain populations suffer from failing social and economic networks of support, and so they become differentially exposed to injury, violence, and death. In this way, all human life is precarious in the sense that each life can be expunged at will or by accident. Its persistence is in no sense guaranteed. Here, I refer to an inherent vulnerability to violence, threat, and destruction that characterizes all social existence. Precariousness in this way implies that we can't live without or outside the social, the fact that one's life is always in some sense in the hands of the other. When we make use of the panopticon effect, we can talk about how mechanisms of the operation of power, surveillance, and discipline serve to enhance the precariousness and the vulnerability of some groups of people and individuals much more so than others. We can also speak about how we become vulnerable to individual people in our immediate everyday life, who are themselves products of power relations or consequences of social forces, and who can make our lives unlivable and unbearable, if you like. by attempting to hurt and scare, control, even dominate, or even wanting to break us. To begin, I wanted to briefly explain how the concept can be utilized within the area of domestic and family violence to make better sense of how gender influences as well as enables coercive control techniques as one example. And then later, I also wanted to describe how we can make use of it to explain as well as give deeper meanings into how actors exposed to public policy and state apparatuses and law become further precarious and vulnerable and disabled subjects trapped within disciplining and conforming, surveilling, and controlling systems, structures that are really global in character. One of the current societal problems that we're faced with is that we still tend to look at violence from a medical, a psychological, and individual perspective to try to understand humanity's capacity for and use of violence. And this narrow approach locks us within a network or a grid of thinking where we rely on repetitive and gendered cultural images, as well as unproven theories and models and ideas on violence. And I think part of the problem here too is that conversations around violence still causes a sense of discomfort within our society. And then strangely, on the other hand, we tend to see it almost as this preoccupation with violence. We see it everywhere within, and in particular within popular culture and social media. So I guess we could say that we hold on to ideas of a very narrow form of violence, and these are part of a fiction about violence that has endured over time. So I'd like to also argue that we need to shift our attention away from some of these enduring ideas and concepts that seem to have the capacity to reinvent themselves. And we need to instead focus our attention and our thinking onto concepts such as gender, control, discipline, and bodies, or we're likely to miss the force and the complexity behind these workings. Coercive control as a form of violence, whether it's expressed by individual subjects or state apparatuses, is very dangerous and potentially very violent. And we're regularly unable to see its more intricate workings because of socio-political orders and social conditions that generate and normalize and even naturalize and sustain violence. And because of older myths about human nature, which paint the idea, for example, that there are two types of human. There are men and then there are women. And there are those who are inherently good and kind and non-violent. And then there are those who are monsters or predators. The panopticon effect is a type of manifold yet subtle process that begins even before masculinist or patriarchal speech games are evoked or expressed. And in my view, women are and men are already born into discourses that generate and support exploitative power structures, which make social minority groups such as women not only more vulnerable to violence in the first place, but make them further vulnerable within heterosexual personal relationships. And women are also vulnerable to the symbolic systems and the institutional structures and the paternalist regulations that extend beyond intimate gendered relationships. But I want to narrow the focus of this application for just a moment, and we can look at the issue of how some men use coercive control as a form of intimate partner violence against their women partners and other family members. And although I recognize that there are different forms of violence that's expressed by different people, I'm here interested in and I'm focusing on the type of violence that's carried out by men against women within intimate heterosexual relationships as forms of domestic or family violence. Now, specific cultural attitudes persist that a female partner simply and always has the choice or the right and a free will to decide to leave a dangerous, threatening male partner or situation. And we sometimes hear public outcries such as, if she was that scared, surely she would have said something earlier. Or if she was in immediate danger, why didn't she just leave? Or if she claims he never laid a hand on her, then she couldn't be in any real danger. Or finally, she's free from the abuse. Now, these statements are based on several assumptions and common taken for granted social attitudes that understand a threat or an act of violence to be not only immediate and physical in expression, but that vulnerability and precariousness are temporary states that therefore somehow end when the abuser either leaves the victim's immediate space or the victim manages to leave the home or the space where the abuser resides or moves about. What we're not made aware of, or what isn't revealed, is that the male abuser regularly employs covert techniques of coercive control, and this extends far beyond social boundaries, and these are not easily identified by outsiders such as friends, family, as well as other community members. And this is also something that Professor Evan Stark unpacks in his work on coercive control. And Stark clearly argues for the importance for moving beyond this physical injury model of domestic violence to focus on the coercive control techniques that allow men to entrap women in personal life. And here, I want to extend this line of thinking by beginning to talk about how the panopticon effect can be used as a gendered lens to explain how male abusers perform gendered identities that appear stable and they appear nonviolent and coherent, but these are in fact at odds with their own manipulative and violent behaviors to conceal their use of coercive control. So these seemingly stable identities are in fact already accepted within our culture as legitimate and reliable. So they're deemed as almost normal behavior, structured and generated by a complex matrix of gendered norms, whereby specific and narrow ideas relating to, say, man, woman, husband, wife, relationships, and even notions of romance and love almost become frozen in time and are already acting upon and through individuals who, like I said, very effectively conceal techniques of coercive control. The mimicry of gender norms by male abusers also prevents us from recognizing the techniques by which male abusers employ coercive control in any social situation, even using other individuals or even children or animals to dominate. Gender proves to be performative, says Butler. That is, constituting the identity it is falsely pretending to be. Gendered performances and seemingly everyday textures of life shape the social opportunities, the techniques, and the power which male abusers can and do employ. So in this way, we shouldn't ask, what can this violence model or that model teach us about gendered violence? Instead, we should ask questions such as, in what way does gender impact on the theories that we use? And how does gender shape and conceal the techniques and the performances which abusers use to dominate, manipulate, and control others? Often, gendered performances employed by the abuser conceal very real threats of violence or micro-acts of domination within the relationship. So the abuser might control the victim through statements such as, if you leave, I'll make sure you have nothing left. Or, watch what will happen if you leave me. The abuser might close bank accounts so that his victim no longer has access to money for food, for shelter, or any outside support. He might, in fact, use his own cultural and social capital to reach other individuals within the community, as well as institutional systems to push and really extend his control and power with the aim of frightening and managing his victim further. As well, he might make contacts with the victim's closest family and friends to create tension and unrest, to completely sever, or with the aim of severing her support networks. He might leave threatening messages in her immediate environment or interfere with her work, tamper with her vehicle or other personal belongings. Here, we're talking about very strategic, very difficult to detect acts of control, but with the aim of destroying the victim's sense of identity and self, life tools, as well as her social world. And other more hidden threats might include stalking and online abuse that often increase once the victim is able to leave the abuser's immediate space. So even though the abuser isn't physically there, the victim is constantly reminded that the abuser is watching, perhaps planning his next move of attack. In this way, the victim isn't free in the sense that she has any real number of choices or opportunities or ways to act or react or behave against this threat. It's a false free choice because she's constantly reminded about the very real possibility of future or further violence. And this regularly means that she now needs to watch her every step when she crosses the street or returns home late at night, perhaps. And in this way, even though the so-called owner of the violent intent is perhaps momentarily invisible to the subject is successfully disciplined. These manipulative and seemingly hidden threats and disciplining techniques are limitless in their expression because they're only limited to the perpetrator's imagination and his ability to perform coherent and seemingly non-threatening gendered identities, such as the protective family man or the concerning husband, to control and disrupt his victim's life world. And I wanted to underscore here too that similar to Foucault's mechanism of panopticism, informed by Jeremy Bentham's 18th century model, the panopticon, precarious subjects become caught up in very complex systems of power, where social control becomes further effective because of not only threats of future violence, but gendered attitudes, roles and behaviors such as heteronormative fantasies and ideals linked to, say, the selfless mother or the obedient wife or the subservient partner. And these, in fact, become accepted as well as internalized. They sort of seep into the consciousness of the victims, forming long-term distortions of their sense of selfhood and their place in the world. We could say that the effect is the creation of an idea of an invisible cage or prison, which is maintained by the threats of making that idea reality. In other words, an individual who has experienced often prolonged techniques of manipulation and control does not really become free or experience freedom from that invisible panopticon because they're always hunted by the threat of the powerful, all-knowing prison guard or the enforcer of that prison. The effect is a normalization of psychic, emotional, and social uncertainty, hypervigilance, acute anxiety, risk, marginality, and even disorders that can and often include intrusive imagery, nightmares, insomnia, a sense of helplessness, unutterable hopelessness, and even paranoia. And ultimately, it creates such an emptiness that the victim person no longer functions. So it becomes a complete shutdown of a person, as well as her inner vulnerability, where even breathing becomes difficult.